Harwick and Harwick.
Thank you, everyone. Is this good volume? You can hear me? Thank you very much for coming out this afternoon, hearing me speak, saving your spot for when Doug Cockle comes on. You know, whatever your motivations, I'm happy you're here. I'm grateful to the organizers who put this incredible event together. We've had so many incredible talks so far. It's a high bar to clear. First, I'll just start with a little bit about me. I'm Rebecca Harwick. I've been working as a game writer, narrative designer for over 10 years. I got my start on the StarWars The Old Republic MMO for BioWare, where I created the Sith Inquisitor class, their voice and their story, their dialogue. And from there I worked also on the Elder Scrolls Online. I made an indie game last year with some friends called Head of State. And this year, the company I work for, Wooga in Berlin, Germany, released a narrative hidden object game called June's Journey, which I had the pleasure to create that entire world and characters in conjunction with my team. And so I've spent a good 10 years from the Sith Inquisitor until now thinking very deeply about this question of what makes a great game protagonist, not just from a writing perspective, but from my perspective as a player. When I play a game, what is it that makes a protagonist stand out to me? What is it that really resonates with me about a protagonist? Why do some protagonists burn themselves in my brain in a certain special way? And what I've narrowed it down to is a deceptively simple answer. A great game protagonist brings the player into the story. Now, what I mean by this isn't simple suspension of disbelief, like in a novel or a TV show. I mean that a great game protagonist gives the player the opportunity to be the center of a story, to be in that story emotionally and impacting that story in many cases, but not all. To break that down further, what do I mean by that? I'm going to use an example from June's Journey, and I promise this entire talk isn't going to be about my work, far from it. But June's Journey is the story of a woman named June who returns home after her sister is murdered. And at one point, she's investigating the murder of her sister, trying to find out what really happened there. Why did her sister die? And she realizes she's going to have to go into her sister Claire's room and search through Claire's private things. And this is a difficult moment for her, and we wanted to bring that home to the player. Now, it's a hidden object game, so what you do is you search through scenes and collect lots of objects. And that is routine to the player at this point in the game. But we introduce every scene with a line of dialogue, and June's line of dialogue here, well, a few lines of dialogue actually, but the thing June says just before the player searches the scene is, "Forgive me, Claire." And shortly after we released June's Journey, I got this lovely message on Facebook from a friend of mine. She says her favorite moment of June's Journey so far is "Forgive me, Claire," and she gives a reason why. She says, "I don't know if you meant it that way, but that was one of those moments when the game action I was habitually doing suddenly became a real thing with meaning to the PC." And I think this sums up exactly what I mean when I say a great protagonist brings the player into the story. A great protagonist becomes a vessel, a personality through which the player can derive meaning and emotional resonance from ordinary, often abstract game actions. Now, how do we do that? Easier said than done. There's basically 6 steps to this, depending on how you break it down, how you define it. First, you need to make this connection. You need to define what the relationship is between the player and the protagonist. Your protagonist needs a look that establishes who they are in the world, the role they have to play, and helps the player reinforce that connection, and helps you find your audience as well. Your protagonist needs a motivation, and that motivation has to be a motivation that the player can buy into and embrace as their own. They need to have values, because values are how characters are tested, how they grow and change. And that's where a lot of the emotional meaning in stories emerges. They need a voice, and I don't strictly mean voice acting here. You can create a character voice without having voice performance, but obviously you're going to get a stronger voice performance if you've done the voice, the work of creating the voice and creating the context for this character. And last but far from least, they need flaws, limitations, things that cause them to make mistakes. And I think if you have an experience in narrative design, you know this is incredibly challenging when dealing with player protagonists, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So let's start with making the connection. Who is the player, and how are they related to this main character? There's a lot of ways to break this down. You can have a main character who is like Lara Croft, fully authored. The player doesn't make choices on her behalf, but you can still get a lot of meaning out of play with a character like that if their personality is strong enough, if their narrative arc and emotional arc is strong enough and well conveyed and well performed. Or you can go fully player defined, like you get with Commander Shepard. Yes, your options as a player are constrained by what the writers have put on the page, but you get a lot of say in not only how Shepard behaves and acts, but even how Shepard looks. Then there's the question of, do you want your protagonist to speak at all? And I don't mean this, again, in a voice acting sense. I mean this in, Link. Link doesn't have any lines that I know of in Breath of the Wild. And a lot of people feel like this is a great way to bring the player into the world because it's just them and their reactions. I think there are limitations, though, to this approach, particularly if you're trying to tell a story, if you're trying to develop a narrative, because narratives are driven by characters making choices and taking actions in them, and by the internal conflicts that those choices and actions create. And it's hard to get that out of Link. What Link and other silent protagonists like the Hunter in Bloodborne I think are exceptionally good for is if you have a game design that centers around experiencing the world, because they kind of step out of the way with their desires and needs, and they let the player just engage almost directly, almost unmediated with the world around them. And that's really what we're talking about when we're saying silent versus speaking. We're talking about an unmediated player-protagonist experience versus a mediated one. To further illustrate what I mean, you experience the world of Geralt through the personality and through the values and through the reactions of Geralt, even as you're helping define some of his choices, right? You don't experience the world of The Witcher as you sitting in a chair. And then there's the question of, do you have just one protagonist or do you have a bunch? And how do you preserve that strong sense of player connection that you want to build across many protagonists? What happens when they talk to each other? Do they never talk to each other? How much does each individual protagonist know of what the player knows? Because the player knows everything. And so you have to be very careful, again, when you're choosing to do multiple protagonists, how you define those limitations and how you sort of stop the player from metagaming and disassociating from these characters. In summation, the type of protagonist you choose is going to depend on the type of game, the intended audience, and what you want your player to feel. So, moving very briefly into how the protagonist needs to look, this is a narrative question. This isn't just an art question. And as an example why, on your right is Pearl, the protagonist of one of Uga's early games. She has this cool flight jacket, and it's a really successful game for Wooga. Her appearance brought a lot of people to the game. They were excited to play as this woman. And on the left is June, the protagonist of June's Journey. And early in the development of this character, we had this whole idea of who June was going to be and what she was going to do. And it didn't involve wearing a flight jacket at all. And of course, the first question we got from management was, Is she cool enough? Should she be wearing a flight jacket? Could she have some sort of other job that we could stick her in some sort of iconic uniform and give her a look? And we argued about this a long time. We did a lot of marketing tests and were able to show that the hat and the feather and stuff, that this was a cool look, that this worked with audiences today. But if we hadn't done that, we would have had to rewrite everything about June. So it was good that we had that discussion early, because it would have been a disaster to have it later. And again, the protagonist is the face of your game. One other thing about these two, they're both white women. And actually, June's Journey has a very diverse cast, but June there is the face of our game, and what does that say to players who come into it? That's one thing that we didn't give enough consideration to when creating our hero. Because the protagonist is the face of your game, and how they look needs to reflect the story you're creating. It would have been no good to send June out there in a flight jacket and then, make a point that she never flies anywhere. All right, now we can get into the juicy stuff. How do you get your player and your hero motivated? Well, let's look at a classic example from all of 3 years ago, but this game just blew up game narrative. So Geralt has a very powerful set of motivations. At first, at the very start of the game, he's trying to find Yennefer, and he has been for a while now. And then once he finds her, he learns he wants to find Ciri, and tied up in that is saving the world. He wants to defeat monsters and solve the mystery of why they're acting up, why they're causing trouble. He wants to do his Witcher job, essentially. He's a professional. He does his job well. I'm probably just reading a little into him that he wants to find cool swords, but let's go with it. The problem with this is that the player's a jerk. And when I'm talking about the player, I'm always talking about me. I'm a jerk. My list of priorities is entirely opposite. When I start The Witcher 3, I'm interested in fighting the monsters, I'm interested in the swords, I'm interested in the scenery. I don't know who Yen is. I didn't finish either of the other Witcher games. I have less idea who Ciri is. They give that little opening scene that you play with the tutorial, but it's not enough yet to form that relationship and create that connection for me. So how do we blend these two? Because that's what good game writing does. It's going to bring the player into the story by melding player and protagonist motivation. Well, in The Witcher, what they do is they're very smart. They know what my short-term motivations are as a player. They know why I'm coming to play this game, so they give me a cool fight. And they let me explore, and they let me loose. And then they introduce Yen with a lot of bombast and excitement, a dramatic scene, a dramatic chase. Lots of people die. It's harrowing. And slowly, as I'm doing what I want to do, exploring and killing cool monsters and doing quests and getting cool stuff and building swords and all of that, I'm getting to know these characters. I'm getting to slip into these relationships. You need that story hook there, that personal story hook, because it's going to pay off as the story develops. But the pitfall is always that the player doesn't have that relationship, and you need to develop it as you go. And you need to, in the meantime, give them stuff that they want to do, that they're excited to do, that they're invested in doing, so that they're there and on the hook for when you've developed that relationship. Another game, much smaller budget, much smaller story, takes an entirely different approach, and it works just as well. Firewatch is the story of a man who runs into the wilderness because his marriage is failing. And if it just started that way, hi, I'm Henry, I ran into the wilderness because my marriage is failing, you wouldn't have that connection as a player whenever you're expected to comment on his opinions about his wife, about this backstory. So what Firewatch does is it gives you this little choose-your-own-adventure text adventure to open it up, and suddenly you're not just reading about how Henry met Julia for the first time, you're meeting Julia for the first time. And you're making these little choices, big and small, about their relationship and about how it plays out. And the result is, when it comes time, when you're in the actual game, when you're out of this prologue, and you're asked about your relationship with your wife, you feel it, because it is your relationship with Henry's wife. Well, you're Henry. So you've developed your protagonist's motivation. That's great. Your protagonist really wants chocolate ice cream. Your protagonist really wants chocolate ice cream, and all this stuff is in the way of your protagonist getting chocolate ice cream. That's a standard external conflict. But what you need to look at is what your protagonist values. What are they willing to do to get chocolate ice cream? And what would persuade them to get vanilla instead? And that's what priorities and protagonist values is about. It's about creating internal conflict that leads to character growth. You decide what your protagonist is willing to do, what lines they're willing to cross, what motivations they're going to prioritize. And then you test them, and you say, well, would you do it this way? Would you? Could you? In a boat? Now, the standard authored one is Batman, who doesn't use guns or kill people. And what makes an interesting Batman story, potentially out of this motivation, is when you see Batman arming himself with increasingly gun-like objects that technically aren't guns because they don't fire bullets that kill people, but they basically are indistinguishable in every other way from guns. And handled well, that can be a really interesting story about Batman slowly eroding his own personal values in this arms race against lunatics. BioWare does a good job with player-defined values. In a game like Dragon Age 2, where they create a whole world and they create a specific aspect of this world. Mages are susceptible to being taken over by demons, and someone's got to keep them in line, but the people who keep them in line basically don't care about free will. And some mages rebel against this by dabbling in blood magic, which makes them even more likely to get taken over by demons. And it throws you into a series of scenarios where you have to choose how you feel about this. And each time, it's kind of changing a few details, testing how committed you are to anti-magery or pro-magery. What if it's your friend who's a blood mage? What then? And then The Witcher, I think, takes a more collaborative approach, because Geralt has some very clearly defined values that he states. And then it asks you sort of what kind of Geralt you want to be. Which values does Geralt prioritize? And these values are still fundamentally Geralt's, but you have a hand in shaping which Geralt sort of wins out. So next is this question of voice. Protagonists need to express themselves, and they express themselves in all kinds of ways. And I'm using voice very loosely here. It's not just voice acting. I'm using it to address all the little details about a character, their personality, their habits and mannerisms, their attitude, their sense of humor, their speech patterns, and yes, their performance. A lot of the above will inform the performance, in fact. And these are so important to know about your character, but you can't really, there's no shortcut to finding them out. Dave Gilbert mentioned earlier today about how he had to sit down and just write lots of dialogue between characters to learn who they were. And that's the way you do it, in my experience. Because every time I say, oh, this character knows X, Y, and Z and loves this, if it doesn't find its way naturally into how the character acts and speaks, how they respond to the situations you're actually going to put them in, they're like, a guy who just walks into this room to say, hey, I love Hawaiian pizza. I'm the guy who likes Hawaiian pizza, and then walks out. And it's hilarious, but do you know anything about who that guy really is? Do you want to? Maybe you want to know. One word of warning. I praised Dragon Age 2 earlier. One place I think it sort of stumbles, especially in comparison to other BioWare games like the Mass Effect series, is establishing Hawke's voice. Hawke doesn't seem to have a consistent voice, and you get a lot of choices that bounce back and forth between I agree to do the thing. I agree to do the thing sarcastically. I agree to do the thing while punching you in the face. And as a player, you can quickly end up feeling like you don't have a character there to play at all. You just have a bunch of moods and attitudes. So lastly, a good protagonist needs to screw up. And this is also part of establishing internal conflict and establishing growth, right? You have limited knowledge and skills, so you make a mistake because you misjudged a situation. But you also have flaws, and sometimes you judge the situation correctly and come up with the wrong answer anyway. But these are opportunities to fail, to grow and change. An all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being is called God, and humankind has spent eons trying to imagine that and struggled endlessly with it, right? You can't tell good stories about someone who doesn't screw up. So what's the problem here? This jerk, remember me, wants to feel powerful and successful while playing the game. Blames the game for failure all the time. I pushed that button at the right time. I dodged that attack. I don't know what you're talking about, Breath of the Wild. And the player's optimizing, min-maxing, trying to make the best choice, trying to get the good ending. So how do you make that player screw up and not hate you, not throw down the game in rage, not disconnect from the character you've worked so hard to connect them to? Well, one option a lot of games take is to make it backstory. You didn't screw up as a player, the character screwed up before you got there. But this is tricky because that threatens to break that connection, right? You form this connection with the protagonist, and now you're saying the protagonist did a bunch of stuff that you don't remember doing. Now, some games pull it off. Knights of the Old Republic, I am going to spoil a 20-year-old game here. I don't think it's that old, actually, but Knights of the Old Republic pulls it off by using amnesia to explain why you don't remember doing those things. And they pull it off by making the whole game about experiencing the consequences of those actions before you realize you were responsible for it. And then when the twist is revealed that you were the evil Sith Lord all along, you can have all manner of reactions depending on the person that you believe yourself to be. And that's powerful. Another approach that might be a little easier to do, well, they're both hard, but it's less reliant on a twist or plot amnesia, is the one that Grim Fandango takes, which I really love. Manny Calavera, at the beginning of Grim Fandango, it's clear he wasn't a terribly good person in life. He's stuck in limbo as a travel agent for the dead. He needs to sell enough tickets to the land of the dead in order to make his commission, in order to get out of there. And some real jerks are keeping him down. His boss and his competitor in the travel agency are conspiring to take all the good commissions, and he's being left with nothing. So naturally, he feels put upon. He feels abused, used. He feels cheated. And you as a player do too. You sympathize with him instantly. He's a funny guy. He's a charming guy. And so you're happy to help him solve all those puzzles, to steal a commission that he thinks he deserves, that you think he deserves, because those guys are bad. And what Manny Calavera learns is that they may have been bad, but that doesn't make him good. He's being selfish stealing this, and it has a real cost to this character, Meche, who ends up wandering the land of the dead for 4 years as a consequence of Manny's selfishness. And the game is about Manny going on this journey to learn that although there are bad people who are worse than him, that doesn't mean that there aren't also good people who are better than him and that he could aspire to be like them. And really, if you take one thing away from my talk, it's play Grim Fandango. Because I think Manny Calavera checks all these boxes, right? You get an instant connection with this guy. A very clear, iconic look. A motivation that you can instantly relate to, buy into. His values are tested and exposed. His voice is distinctive and memorable. And he has flaws. He's not a perfect character, but those flaws never disrupt your sense that you're able to succeed as him, able to play as him, able to go on a journey with him. And so with that, I'll leave it to you if you have any questions, and thank you.
Hi. Having worked as a game writer for 10 years and being a woman yourself, have you noticed any change in the way female main characters are displayed on video games?
Well, for one, I feel like there's a few more of them now. For another, I think there are quite a few women writers out there now who are writing female characters, and that has improved and textured and enriched their portrayal. I think in general, from my experience, June's Journey was still the first game where I got to work with a female protagonist in 10 years. And that's because the game, we knew our market was going to be mostly women. And that's still a thing that does come up, even in past projects, even dealing with NPCs. At one point on StarWars: The Old Republic, I don't know if I should say this, I might make EA mad, but we were told to keep our female NPC count to around 30%. Yeah. Because I guess if you have more, it seems like there's too many. I don't know. Yes?
In your line of work, what is something you can think about as innovative? What's innovation look like in your line of work? What do you think can be innovation, or where?
In general, in game writing?
Yeah.
I think in general in game writing, and a lot of indie titles expose this. The Witcher 3 recently exposed this. We still have a long way to go in terms of creating reliably emotive and meaningful experiences. I think what's great about coming to a conference like this is that you have indie creators like Dave, like so many others out here who are freer to focus on character-driven work, but a lot of AAA stuff is still in the everything's gonna explode, save the world, no time for rest or friendship or any of those wonderful things that to me are central to the human experience and central to why we even want to save the world in the first place. Okay, one more. I think your hand was up first.
I'm curious about it. You've mentioned like player-authored versus, or like player-determined versus fully authored characters, and the kind of blend between the two. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about like moments in games where control is taken away from the player for narrative reasons, like without any spoilers, certain parts of The Last of Us, for example, where the story is used to kind of wrestle control out, and are there good or bad ways of doing that?
That's a talk in and of itself. When to take control away from the player and how to do it without making the player mad. I think in general, if you have a major decision point, you take control away from the player at your own risk. I think games like The Witcher and Firewatch, actually, they have their protagonists will speak without you choosing lines for them. But anytime there's a significant choice that could shape who the character is or branch the story, you get a say in it, and it's clearly marked. I think the ending of The Last of Us is about perfect for the narrative arc of Joel, but I think it does break that connection between player and protagonist at a critical moment. All right? Thank you.